Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at malwares. Is it this way? Yeah. Well, malware is short for malicious software. This includes viruses, worms, spyware, Trojan horses, rootkits, ransomware, pretty much everything, right? Anything that does something that you don't want it to run, then it's a malware. Okay, so let's have a look. The total number of malwares is unfortunately very high. Okay, so this was last updated 2018. As you can see, the trend is growing. Okay, maybe it seems a little bit tipping off at the end. So even though the number of malware seems to be tipping off, well, we still have that many samples laying around, and there are a lot of other works to create different malwares that infects people. So we're not going to see the slowdowns of this anytime soon. Okay, and here's another example, and this one is looking at ransomware. And ransomware is also another examples of malware. And basically, you can also see that the number of ransomware is increasing rapidly too, right? So malware is quite a big problem in today's world, and it is quite large. It is largely affecting a lot of users, and we are always constantly worried about being infected by those that ruins our computing systems. Okay, so let's have a look at virus first. So virus is a malicious program that spreads through the network by infecting various files. Okay, it does have similar characteristics as biological viruses. What they do is just come into your body and then start multiplying, right? And it multiplies so much such that your body can't function properly, and that's how virus works in computing systems too. They infect different files, they duplicate themselves onto those files, and then keep spreading. Eventually, as the symptoms of virus, your computer will become slow, it will take up more space, and your applications will stop working because it's running virus scripts. Unfortunately, when virus infects a file, it can reinfect, and it infects multiple times. So it means it's running the virus script multiple times every time you run it. Okay. So infected files will execute the malicious program without the user knowing first, hence getting slower, and then run the normal program. Okay, so that way you probably won't notice it first, but as time passes, things get slower and slower because the amount of virus code that has to run is growing larger. Okay, so viruses will also replicate itself by replacing other executable files by attaching the malicious program. Okay. Many viruses spread through file sharing. That's why email attachments through the spam is quite common. What they do is they spread some virus that they crafted and then do something with it. So this includes email attachments, but also USB sharing, file transfer protocols, downloads, and so forth. Okay. So whenever you download some softwares or applications, make sure you check the provider's main web page and see whether they provide things like checksums or something like that, so you can always check it. Okay, requires the infected files to be transferred to other hosts. So viruses themselves, they don't necessarily move around, they don't have the capability to do that, but they only have capability to replicate themselves. Okay, so that's how the viruses work. Okay, and viruses comes in many forms. It can be file infected viruses, boot sector viruses, macroviruses or macroviruses. Okay, and all those viruses will infect different parts of your computing systems, including your BIOS. It can even sit in your RAM or stay with the application like the traditional ones, well, the old style ones, right? And viruses also can mutate, and this makes detecting viruses very difficult. Here's a few examples, and we'll cover each one, but it largely divides into three types: oligomorphic, polymorphic, and metamorphic. So let's start with oligomorphic mutation first. Okay, so oligomorphic viruses, what they normally do is they can encrypt themselves. They have a functionality to do that, and when they decrypt, they come back to its own self. So before and after the encryption, they are the same. And what we normally do is we're trying to detect viruses because when they are shared through the files, they're in an encrypted form. So the detection happens in the middle. Okay, so you can see how quickly this can become quite difficult depending on how complex the encryptions are. But originally, those were quite simple. There were only a few different encryption schemes you used and very few resulting encrypted viruses. Okay, but they changed a little bit more. So polymorphic viruses are a little bit more complex, and these ones are a lot more common nowadays. So basically, what they do is have a mutation. So what this mutation do is it preserves its original functionalities, but changes how it gets executed. For example, let's give a simple example of, say, equations, right? So you can have 3 plus 5, this will result in 8. But you can modify this to 3 plus 5 plus 1 minus 1. So this will have a same resulting effect. So you can do this in the virus codes as well. You can add something simple, even a bunch of spaces or just like empty print statements. It's not going to affect the virus operations, but it's adding some other operations that will result in different encrypted viruses. So after the mutation, it encrypts itself, and when it decrypts itself, it comes back to the mutated form. And basically, this is different to your original form with your final mutation. However, in polymorphic viruses, these mutations are actually quite simple. So there are ways to identify these in easier way. Okay, we'll look at that later. And then we have these called metamorphic viruses, and these are very difficult to detect. However, they are also very difficult to create. Okay, so for example, original malware code looks like this, and after the mutation, it looks totally different. Okay, and basically you're creating a new virus that looks totally different. However, they will still do something that are the same. Okay, so going back to our simple math equation, 5 plus 3 equals 8. So if the polymorphic mutation was like plus 1 minus 1, then metamorphic mutation is more like 5 plus 3 converted to 10 minus 2. Okay, so the equation is totally different. However, the resulting effect is the same. And that's what makes the metamorphic viruses much harder to detect in practice. Okay, so let's have a look at an example, a virus called Salex. Okay, so this is a new version of Salex released in 2019 that targeting the IoT devices. Okay, what Salex do is it bricks them, which means it makes the IoT useless. You have to reformat the software in order to use the hardware again. Okay. So let's have a look what it does. An overview. Firstly, it removes the storage, so it doesn't have anything to link to work with. Okay, it removes the IP tables, so it means it can't connect to anything. That means you can't remotely connect to fix it. And removes network configurations. So basically, it wipes the data and wipes out the way it can communicate, and hence it can't do anything. Okay. And as a result, it holds the device. Okay, so let's have a look at a bit more step by step. Okay, first one is enumerate accessible IP addresses. Okay, and then it identifies all Unix-like systems. Okay, so this virus looks at all the IP addresses it can connect to within the IoT, and then if it's a Unix-like system, it will try to log in using the default credentials. And believe it or not, a lot of IoT devices still uses default login credentials. Yeah, hence, design is very important. Oh, it's raining outside a lot. Okay, anyway. Once they found and be able to log in, right? So even at number 3, you can protect your IoT devices a lot by just changing these regulations. Anyway, step 4, it accesses all the disk partitions via fdisk-l, and then delete the network config. Okay, and then it's going to run this particular command to delete everything else. Okay. Finally, flush all IP tables and drops to all connections. Okay, so those are the simple script that this virus Salex runs on IoT devices. So you can see that it's very simple code, but if it's able to log in and just run this script, it's very effective at just breaking your IoT device. Okay, therefore, so yeah, please keep that in mind. Do not use default login credentials. So go home, go to your Wi-Fi router, and make sure it's not using default login and passwords. Okay, so here's another one. This is part of my research, and it's relevant here. So you've seen that how malwares can be mutated, right? But exactly how do they mutate? There's 2 ways. The virus will have its own mutation code it runs, so it has the module, or you can mutate a given virus to something else yourself. And this both should be utilized in terms of attackers. And what we want to do is understand exactly which mutations are effective. So we created this malware generator, which takes in the malware sample, and then it goes through some modifier. And this particular example uses genetic algorithm. If you don't know what that is, please take machine learning courses. And then we make sure that these virus codes are not corrupt and can be executable. And then we validate through some sandbox reports. Okay, and once that's done, it needs to meet certain criteria. It needs to look quite different from the original, and that's where the score comes in. We look at the detection rates as well as similarity scores, and if the detection rate has improved or remains the same, we don't want higher detected ones. But at the same time, the similarity is quite different. That means we create a good variant out of that. And what did we find? Well, don't worry about those acronyms, but basically we tried different changes to each malware and tested against some of the malware detection solutions. So you probably be familiar with things like Avast, AVG, Kaspersky, MalwareBots, McAfee, Trend Micro, and so on. And we found that up to 20% of the time, the malwares that we generated can bypass them. So that means I generate 5, 1 out of those 5 will be able to bypass this. And if you look at your computer and check what virus detection software you use, you're not going to use a bunch of them. Ideally you can, but obviously that's going to overload your computing power just to detect viruses. So typically people use only like 1, 2, and maybe at most 3. And because we have limited number of antivirus softwares that we use, these generators can be quite effective in infecting people. Yeah, if you're interested in this particular research, do let me know. We can discuss further. Otherwise, so what can we do to protect against viruses? Well, use antiviruses. Yeah, they're already built to optimize detections against them. So you don't have to do it yourself. You should utilize those tools. Okay, as usual, as a computer scientist, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Scan all email attachments, check virus activities. Examples include blah blah blah. Incorporate sandboxing, AI data mining, machine learning, etc. Okay, so there's a heaps of things related to antiviruses, but in this particular unit, we don't go into detail about how they work. Okay, but along with antiviruses, you can also restrict the access. Okay, this means you don't want people to be accessing your device remotely. Make sure your firewall is running correctly and email filters are implemented well. Okay. All right, moving on to worms. Okay, so worms are a little bit different to viruses. Basically, they focus on spreading through the network. So viruses are more about replicating itself on a system, and they get carried out by people sharing it. Whereas worms, they're not really duplicating themselves, but they're more interested in spreading around. Okay, so what they do is not attach them onto executables, but rather exploit various network vulnerabilities to spread itself. So that means it's trying to detect shared drives and go through there, trying to find file transport protocol vulnerabilities like buffer overflows, and there's a few examples there. Okay, but typically a lot of those malwares, they're not just worm or virus or something else. It combines a few of those characteristics together, and that's why it's so devastating. So for example, MyDoom A, it installed backdoor and applied DOS, but as soon as it started to do DOS stuff, it was quite easy to detect. So there was a second variant, MyDoom B, which was MyDoom A, but plus also access to antivirus sites. This means even when you detect some even when you detected some symptoms, you are not you did not have any access to antiviruses to detect and remove those. Okay, so they keep revising the original versions to make it harder for people to do something about it. Okay, so as briefly mentioned before, worms and viruses, they are two different things. Viruses do not intentionally try to spread itself from their computer to other computers, and that's where humans comes in and spread. Okay, whereas worms is designed to copy itself from one computer to the other over a network. Okay, and that's what the worms are more worried about. But because they have the tendency of spreading around, people attach some other stuff on top of the worm. So worms can carry viruses as well. Okay. So here's an example, a slammer, and this is always a good example because it was very effective at the time. So this is nearly 2 decades ago. Basically, the slammer worm got released on that time and infected 75,000 victims, and it went all around the world in under 10 minutes. That's pretty quick, and it doubled infections every 8.5 seconds. Okay, and the size, very tiny, only 376 bytes long. Okay, so that's 376 characters of code, right, including the headers and whatnot. Okay, okay. So propagation technique, very simple. It had a single UDP packet, 376 bytes payload, targeting port 1434, which was the Microsoft SQL monitor, and at the time it wasn't patched. And it just keeps sending itself to random IP addresses, and it worked at the time because people didn't really have good security measures to block requests trying to come into ports, right? So once host identified running unpatched Microsoft SQL Server, it is infected immediately because it's so tiny, it just downloads stuff. Okay, so here is a map of infected locations. Guess how long this took? It only took half an hour for this worm to spread around the globe and infect that much area. Okay, so what do we do to protect against worms? Well, patching up to date is most important because it exploits the network vulnerabilities. Make sure your network security is up to standard, but as well as your applications, because it can leak through the applications. Your network itself does not necessarily know what your application is doing and think it might be legitimate. Later we will learn more about it when we cover firewalls, but basically firewalls can't really see what your application is doing nowadays because of encryptions. Okay, and also security education: do not click suspicious links, run executable files or programs, as well as keeping up to date with your antiviruses and anti-spyware softwares, okay, and firewall. But we'll cover that in a specific video. Otherwise, there's a lot more to malware, but I would like to separate them out. So we will stop here and see you in the next video. Bye.